Ch.66. To ascend is human, to fall is also human.
Si Lian turned his head and asked, "What do you mean?" The homeless street urchins of the royal capital all run together in a gang, and they'd come to my neighborhood often to beg for food.
I know all of them, but I've never seen this child before.
That young child stared at Mu King and didn't say a word.
Feng Xin was incredulous.
Who do they beg for food from? You. And you'd give it to them? Mu King glared at him. If they pester relentlessly, there's no other way. Feng Xin still thought the notion rather unbelievable but didn't make any further commentary.
Oh. Si Lian wanted to laugh watching them talk. Mu King continued.
Besides, there's sewn patches on his clothes. Judging by the needlework, it must have been done by a grown-up only just recently, so there's at least someone of age in his household. His family situation might not be the best, but he's definitely not a beggar.
Naturally, Si Lian would not notice the details of needlework on sewn patches, nor if it was done by adults.
But Mu King used to be an errand boy at the Royal Holy Pavilion, and also did all kinds of chores at home, so when Si Lian looked closely, it was indeed as he had said. So he asked, "Do you have grown-ups at home?" That young child shook his head, but Mu King said, "There must be.
If he doesn't go back, his family must be worried sick looking for him by now."
No way. There's nobody. That young child cried, sounding like he was afraid to be sent back, and he
opened his arms reaching for Si Lian.
He was still covered with mud and blood, and Feng Xin couldn't stand it anymore.
"Kid, what the hell are you doing?"
"Things were urgent earlier, so whatever, but shouldn't you know better by now? This is the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince, do you understand?" That young child's arms immediately shrank back, but he was still gazing at Si Lian.
"There's fighting at
home and I got kicked out. I walked for a long time but I've nowhere to go." The other three looked at each other. After a moment, Feng Xin said, "So what now?" One of the imperial doctors suggested, "If His Highness is troubled, he can be placed here in the palace and have a few attendants take care of him." Si Lian hummed, but after some thought, shook his head slowly. At the end of the day, he was afraid Qi Rong wouldn't drop the whole thing, and would sneak out to cause trouble. The way I see it, it's still best if I watch over him until his wounds are healed.
It seems his family won't
be able to look after him, unfortunately. Feng Xin, when you go take care of the affected stalls toppled by Qi Rong, see if you can find out where his parents are, and let them know so they don't worry. All right, Feng Xin nodded. One of his arms was still in a sling, but he extended the good arm to reach for that young child, intending to pick him up by the collar. Si Lian laughed. "You're wounded. Don't worry about it." However, Feng Xin shrugged it off. "Only one arm is broken, the other's still fine. If both my arms were broken, I can still use my teeth to carry him by the collar and bring him up the mountain for you." Mu King rolled his eyes from behind him, then spoke up. "Never mind. Let me carry him." But just as he made one step forward, that young child jumped off the bed himself and said, "I can walk on my own." An expression filled with rejection spoke louder than words, and it made Mew King's second step extremely awkward, unsure of whether or not to proceed. That little kid had 5 broken ribs and a broken leg, but he was still as lively as a dragon.
Si Lian really didn't know whether to laugh or feel concerned.
He said, "Stop running around." Then he bent down and picked him up. The 3 of them with a child in tow left the palace. Since Qi caused havoc on the streets earlier and disturbed the townspeople, toppling a number of stalls, Si Lian felt deeply guilty, having no face to meet any of the citizens, so the group snuck around, afraid to show their faces, using only the back alleyways. Throughout the entire way, that small child was extremely docile in Si Lian's arms. They told him to be quiet and he uttered not a single sound. Feng Xin glared. "This brat kicked me yesterday, but look at him now. He really knows how to pick them. It's His Highness the Crown Prince. Of course he's more well-liked than most people," Mew King said. For some reason, even if he said something well-meaning, the words he used still made people feel uncomfortable. Feng Xin refused to acknowledge what he said. After walking for a while, Feng Xin spoke up. "No. I still feel Your Highness shouldn't let anyone see you holding a strange child." "What's the problem?"
Si Lian asked.
"You're the Crown Prince," Feng Xin exclaimed. While he spoke, he saw a worn-down handcart further up the alley and said, "Put the kid in that cart and pull it to go." Mew King immediately voiced, "Just so we're clear, I will not pull that thing up the mountain." "No one's asking you to," Feng Xin said.
He reached out and pulled the child from Si Lian's arms, and
the child started struggling again. "Never mind, forget it.
Maybe someone else needs that cart,"
Si Lian said.
Just then, from somewhere nearby, someone suddenly called out,
"Are you the Crown Prince?" Another immediately shouted, "Yes, yes, yes. That's the Crown Prince. His mask fell yesterday and I saw his face with my own eyes. That's him!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark.
"Catch him!"
Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. The 3 of them froze, their hearts dropped. Although Si Lian didn't think he did anything wrong at the heavenly ceremonial procession the day before, he also knew that others might not believe the same. 2. Cut short, the God-pleasing martial ceremony was an ominous sign of misfortune. It was unspeakable amongst the nobility, and when all the excitement wore off after the fact, when the people started wondering what it all meant, they probably wouldn't be as forgiving either. Adding on the havoc on the streets caused by Qi, the complaints must be endless.
If they were to be surrounded now, it might
end badly. Without thinking any deeper, Mew King grabbed him and shouted, "Your Highness, run!" Feng Xin was pulling the cart and urged, "Too, Your Highness, I've a broken arm, I won't be able to stop
anyone rioting.
Go." However, outside the alleyway there was already a mass of people who were pouring in, their faces filled
with excitement, blocking all viable exits.
The 4 of them had nowhere to run, and watched wide-eyed as
they became encircled. Si Lian thought boldly, "If anything, I'll just let them beat us down without fighting back."
However, unexpectedly, although the crowd poured in, they didn't pulverize them. Instead, a number of
Hands reached out and threw him into the air, cheering, "Your Highness." Si Lian was thrown into the air countless times but still maintained a calm and steady disposition.
The people shouted, "Your Highness, that leap on the martial deity avenue yesterday
was spectacular."
Someone exclaimed, "That was such an amazing jump."
Really, I totally thought the heavenly
martial emperor himself had descended. I had goosebumps. Another validated, "His Highness was right to save that kid. A life is a life, did they think kids from us? Poor people aren't the same.
If it were me, I'd do the same."
Another raged, "That's right. Today there was talk of how His Highness had ruined the event and I just couldn't stand it.
If it had been a royal or a noble who had fallen, they wouldn't say the same."
Your Highness, don't mind those people. His Highness is the one who truly cares about us. Si Lian went from feeling guilty at the beginning, then disoriented halfway through, until finally, he was affected by the passionate and cheerful faces all around. The crowd clustered around Si Lian, and when they emerged onto the main street, more and more joined them. Feng Xin, Mu King, and that young child were pushed away and separated a far way back without any means of pushing through, and could only follow along behind the parade. This large assembly of people was surprisingly not smaller than the crowd from the day before. Every time Si Lian made a move to leave, he would be forcibly dragged back in and thrown into the air without any chance of being let down.
Si Lian couldn't help but find it both funny and reassuring as he thought to himself, "The people and
Guoxi have completely opposite sentiments.
It looks like I was in the right." When at last they reached Mount Taikang, the setting sun was ablaze brightly and vividly.
Passing through the large mountain gates, on the long winding stone path, there were a number of trainees and cultivators carrying water buckets and firewood going up and down the road, greeting Si
Lian and company, but many watched the four plus a cart with wonder.
Feng Xin was pulling that handcart
with one hand like a hard-working, serious young black bull. Si Lian and Mu King smiled back dutifully at
first, but after a while they stopped caring. The maple trees were endless, and the wheels turned calmly.
As they hiked, Si Lian helped push the handcart from behind.
He was feeling good, and asked that young child another question casually. "Little kid, what is your name, really?" "Hong what?"
That young child watched him and said in a small voice, I don't have a name."
Si Lian was taken aback. "Your mother didn't give you a name?"
That young child shook his head. "My mother passed." Si Lian felt sad for him.
"Then what did your mother use to call you?" That young child was hesitant for a minute, then replied, Hong Hong 7. Si Lian smiled. "That's a cute nickname. I'll call you that from now on." Hong Hong seemed to be shy whenever they talked, and lowered his head. Just then the sun was about to set, and lights were ignited from each of the pavilions all over the mountain. Among them, the brightest was of course the highest peak, the Great Martial Summit. Atop the Great Martial Summit, within the Great Martial Hall, it was as bright as day, the lights gathered like stars. Si Lian sighed as he watched. The sigh wasn't born of sadness, but from the scenery that emanated such beauty and glory. Every bit of light within the hall was an offered everlasting lamp. Each lamp contained the prayers and wishes of a devout worshipper. The more everlasting lamps there were within the temple of a god, the more powerful that god became. The chance to offer a lamp within the great martial hall of the royal holy pavilion was
difficult to buy even with 1,000 pieces of gold.
Wealth, power, ability, passion, affinity, there must be one of the 5 conditions fulfilled in order to enter the hall to offer light. Yet there were more in the world that had none of the 5. The 4 of them stopped, gazing upon the great martial hall that shone like the sun, their expressions dissimilar. Just then, there was a familiar voice that called out to them, "Your Highness." Si Lian turned his head and saw a fair-faced young man hurrying towards him. It looked like the trainee
who guarded the entrance of the Xixiang pavilion, and Si Lian schooled his expression.
"Zhu Shisheng, what's the hurry?"
Zhu Shisheng noticed Mu King standing behind, but felt awkward, and spoke pretending not to have seen
him. "The Guoshi has been asking after you for a while now. He's waiting at the great martial hall."
Si Lian was taken aback hearing this, but figured it must be in regards to the incident during the
heavenly ceremonial procession the day before. "Very well. Thank you, Shisheng." Si Lian had Feng Xin and Mu King take Hong Hong back to the Xianlei pavilion first before heading towards the great martial summit. Outside the great hall, clouds born from the incense vessel floated and wrapped around the great martial hall, forming a dream-like state. On either side of the vessel were long rows of bright everlasting
lamps hung in the air, neatly lined into a wall of lanterns.
Every everlasting lamp had on them the name
and prayer of the worshipper in elegant, decorous writing. Once in the hall, on either side of the wall were
also rows upon rows of hung everlasting lamps.
The lamps offered within the great martial hall were of
course even more valuable than the ones outside. In the gigantic, spacious temple, the Guoshi was offering incense before the statue of the martial heavenly emperor, and the 3 deputy Guoshi were behind him, uniformly prostrating before the great god. Si Lian inclined his head when he entered
Guoshi.
The Guoshi completed their ritual before they turned their heads back and made a gesture for him to come forward.
Thus, Si Lian approached, took an incense stick, and also paid his respects in sincerity.
It was a moment before Guoshi finally spoke. "Your Highness, the 4 of us have deliberated. In regards to the heavenly ceremonial procession, there are but 2 ways to resolve it."
"Please do enlighten me, Guoshi," Si Lian said.
"The first method," Guoshi said, "is to find the child who disrupted the procession, and then we shall conduct a ceremony. At the very least, one of his 5 senses must be sealed as penance." 7. Hong Hong means my son, ready, or just little red.
Next chapter.
Ch.67 To ascend is human, to fall is also human too. Si Lian whipped up his head. "No," he then repeated with severity, "definitely not." Guoshi nodded. "I had expected this response from you.
So, we've put the weight of our consideration on
the second method. Please enlighten me," Si Lian said solemnly.
The second method, Guoshi said,
is to have your Highness publicly repent before the people of Xianlei. Ask the heavens for forgiveness, then face the wall in reflection for a month. "Not possible," Si Lian said calmly.
Guoxi was taken aback.
We're not really asking you to face the wall to reflect, you just have to look like.
You are, ahem. He suddenly remembered they were before the statue of the heavenly martial emperor.
And immediately corrected himself. As long as you are sincere it will suffice. Still, Si Lian responded with no. And the reason?
Guoxi asked.
Guoxi, when I descended the mountain today, do you know what I saw? Si Lian said. Not only did the people at the royal capital not condemn the accident that happened during the heavenly ceremonial procession, they very much approved of it. This proves that the people of this kingdom all believe that the decision to save that child was right. If I were to do as you say, and be punished for something that was done right, what would they think?
Doesn't this only tell everyone that to save a life, not only do we not obtain fortuitous merits, but instead,
we'll be punished for our sin? How should they think or act after that?
Whether it's right or wrong isn't important, Guoxi said.
Only that you must choose between the two paths.
Nothing is perfect in this world.
Either the child shoulders this blame, or you do. Whether right or wrong is very important. If I must choose, then I choose the third path, Si Lian replied. Guoxi rubbed his forehead. Your Highness, excuse my boldness, but why do you care what they think?
Today they think in such a way, tomorrow they'll think another. There's no need for you to mind the small details. Trust me, people will carry on doing what they need to do, and will not be touched by your actions, nor take you as an example. It's best if we focus on serving what's above our heads. Si Lian was silent for a moment, then spoke. Guoxi, ever since I've entered the royal holy pavilion to become a disciple here, the more I train, the more I've reflected. There's actually something I've always thought, but didn't dare to speak of. And what's that? Guoxi asked. Is it really right for us to worship and prostrate before the gods like this? Guoxi was speechless for a moment.
If they don't worship the gods, then what are we to do? Go
homeless. What? Your Highness thinks that the thousands and millions of devotees who come here to
worship have the wrong beliefs.
Si Lian shook his head and chewed on his words.
The beliefs are not wrong. Only, this disciple doesn't think it right to prostrate. He raised his head and pointed to the golden, scintillating, glorious and large statue of the heavenly martial emperor. When humans ascend, they become gods. To humans, gods are elders, are teachers, are the everlasting light, but they are not our masters. In such regard, we should be full of thankfulness and also admiration.
But never idol worship.
Just like the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession, the correct attitude should be of thankfulness, of joy, not of fear, not begging to please, not of intimidation, and certainly not putting myself in a position of servitude.
Guoxi remained poised and silent, but the other three deputy Guoxi appeared to have become restless. Turning their heads back,
Si Lian continued, an accident happened, it couldn't be helped. I am willing to offer 1,000 lamps to brighten long nights, like moths to flames, I'm not afraid.
But I refuse to bow my head for something I did.
Right. Face the wall in reflection.
What have I done wrong?
What has anyone done wrong? Just like how Qi Rong committed evil, but Feng Xin who subdued the wrongdoer had to be punished, where's the logic? in all this.
If the heavens have eyes, they would not condemn me for this.
Guoshi looked away. Then, Your Highness, let me ask you. If the heavens really do condemn you, will you apologize then? If that should happen, then, the heavens are in the wrong. I am right. I will stand against the heavens
and defy until the end.
Hearing this, Guoshi's face changed slightly, and he smiled. Your Highness, you're pretty brave to say
such words.
The other three deputy Guoshi watched him, wanting to speak, but stopping themselves. Just then, a sudden huge alarm went off outside the hall, like the chiming of multiple bells at once.
The four Guoshi could no longer remain in their seats, and all rushed up at the same time, running towards the back of the hall.
Si Lian followed closely behind. They traversed through the many buildings behind the great martial hall, and came before a black pagoda. The doors to that black pagoda were open, and countless wisps of dark smoke were whooshing out. The Guoshi let out a despairing scream. Where's Xuan? Exclamation mark.
Where the hell did he go?
How did this happen? Exclamation mark.
A number of trainee guards rushed over. The one leading was that Zhu Shisheng.
Guoshi! Exclamation mark. I'm here. I don't know what happened. The door was locked, but it suddenly opened on its own. Guoshi pulled at his hair. Quickly! Bring me a new soul-sealing jar. Si Lian rushed straight inside.
Within that black pagoda, the walls were covered in lattice sandalwood.
Panels of varying sizes and shapes, stacked unevenly atop each other. Within each panel were various clay jars, porcelain vases, jaded boxes, and so on.
Each of those containers were originally securely placed, the
red cover stoppers stuffed firmly in place, the openings sealed with yellow talismans inscribed with crimson spells, but now, many were shattered, and many more continued to drop off the shelves. Themselves, those not yet fallen were all swaying and vibrating. Those soul-sealing containers each had a demon or ghost who once caused havoc sealed within, and such.
A black pagoda existed in every single temple on Mount Taikang, purposely utilizing the clean, saintly essence to keep them suppressed.
However, something happened that caused this sudden insurgence, and
they had all escaped.
It's too late.
Si Lian shouted.
He immediately kicked the doors closed.
The steel lock that originally chained up the door had been
broken by the resentful spirits, so Si Lian unsheathed his sword, used the tip and drew out some characters, then plunged it down. He brought over 200 swords with him when he entered the mountain, and he'd switched the one carried on his person almost every day. Each was an incomparable, singular treasured sword. That sword, having been slantily stabbed into the ground, sealed the door shut. And only the sounds of resentful spirits within rioting and roaring could be heard.
Once they left the black pagoda, they looked up and atop each of the summits, all the black pagodas
behind each temple were filled with black clouds. All the resentful spirits were rushing to the sky, flying towards a certain direction that was now heavy with smoke. What's over there?
Why are they all flying over there?
Zhuan asked. Guoshi yelled, are you dumb?
Exclamation mark. That's the Xianle pavilion.
The group ran like the wind, and in the blink of an eye, arrived at the Xianle summit.
On top of Mount
Taikang, heavy, thick smoke emerged from countless temples across innumerous peaks, and rolled over to form an enormous swirl above the Xianlei pavilion. What's going on in that Xianlei pavilion of yours? Exclamation mark. All the demons and ghosts are being lured over. What exactly did you put inside?
Guoshi demanded.
Si Lian was bewildered too.
Nothing.
Just
what?
Si Lian suddenly remembered that small child. Just then, Zhu Shisheng cried, Guoshi, this is bad. His Highness' place is on fire. Sure enough, a corner of the Xianlei pavilion was alight, flames bursting towards the sky, reflecting dark
crimson in the black clouds above.
Yet, at the foot of Mount Taikang, all those in the royal capital who hadn't gone to bed had no idea what was going on when they witnessed the scene from afar, and were excitedly dragging others to watch in awe.
Wow!
The great immortals on the godly mountain are conducting a ceremony. What a show! Soon, the group of them arrived at the Xianlei pavilion. Si Lian didn't keep too many servants, and a
number of cultivators from the other summits had rushed over, desperately drawing well water, trying to
put out the fires. Si Lian didn't see his two attendants, and immediately rushed inside. All the resentful spirits of Mount Taikang had been gathered there. The Xianlei pavilion was completely pitch black inside. Nothing could be seen. Si Lian sensed two silhouettes within the main hall and yelled, Feng Xin. Mu King. The two had drawn a protection array so as to not let the evil spirits invade, holding on, but just barely. Sure enough, Feng Xin's voice rang out.
Your Highness, don't come in.
This child is strange, all those spirits were coming
for him.
Only then did Si Lian notice that behind the two silhouettes was another small shadow, seemingly to be
kneeling on the floor, his head in his hands.
He screamed, It's not me! Exclamation mark.
Exclamation mark.
After observing them for a moment, Si Lian shouted, Stop holding on.
Let it go.
Mu King cried back, We can't let go. If we do, those things will go crazy. Let me find the most.
Si Lian cut him off.
No fear.
Let go.
Now. Mu King gritted his teeth, and dropped his hands with Feng Xin at the same time.
Sure enough, with the
restraints off, those resentful spirits screeched and started going wild. However, in the next second, Si Lian reached out, lightning fast, and choked a particular wisp of black smoke. He didn't even look, and grabbed that black smoke with his bare hands, holding in his palm firmly. The moment he caught that one resentful spirit, all the crazed swarm of resentful spirits within the Xianlei pavilion slowed down. Outside, everyone silently nodded. In a situation where a large swarm of resentful spirits gathered in the same place, they would usually follow the lead of the strongest one. Once that one is caught without a leader, the spirits would lose direction. At that moment, Si Lian immediately recognized the strongest one and choked it, not giving it any chance, and with only a squeeze, that one resentful spirit disintegrated into nothing in his palm. Immediately after, the four Guoshi raised their sleeves and called out, Come back! That swarm of resentful spirits, having lost its leader, flew haphazardly around the Xianlei pavilion like headless flies until finally they had no choice but to give up, and reluctantly returned to the seal within the Guoshi's sleeves. The other cultivators continued to put out the remaining fires, and only until the
heavy smoke had gradually dispersed, did Si Lian see clearly the figures of the other three.
Feng Xin and Mu King were half-kneeled on the floor, still in shock. Behind them, that child was still, holding his head, uttering not a word. The Guoshi entered and spoke after only a look. Where did that child come from? Feng Xin said all the resentful spirits were going after him. What's going on? That's the child who fell from the city wall during the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession.
All the Guoshi were taken aback. Guoshi demanded, "Why did you bring him here?"
Si Lian shook his head, not wanting to explain, and instead asked Feng Xin, what did he do to attract all the resentful spirits of the Black Pagodas? One of Feng Xin's arms was still in a sling, and he rose to his feet. I don't know what he did. But once he
entered the mountain, soon after coming inside the Xianlei pavilion, all those black things suddenly flew over from all over the peaks and broke in, swarming around him, gathering more by the minute, and we
couldn't get out. Si Lian looked around at the walls and pillars burned to a crisp inside the pavilion. Then what's with the fire? Mu King, whose face was covered in soot, said, we couldn't leave, so we had to draw an array to defend.
Those resentful spirits kindled the candlelight and burned the curtains, hoping to force us out.
Thank goodness your highness came swiftly and immediately seized their vitals. Otherwise, if it kept burning, we'll all be dead along with the array. Hearing his words, Mu King closed his eyes and lowered his head.
On the side, the Guoshi had already
surrounded that young child, observing him closely.
Guoshi, is there anything the matter with that child?
If there was anything the matter, such as being possessed by ghosts, Si Lian should have been able to recognize it immediately. After having trained at the Royal Holy Pavilion for a number of years, he had worked on his sight especially, and very few things could deceive his eyes. Yet he couldn't see anything off with this child. The Guoshi shook his head, also seeming to have observed nothing amiss. He asked, what's your birth date, month, year, and time? Hong Hong seemed to be guarded against everyone, tensed with hostility, and would only stare at him, not speaking.
Si Lian encouraged gently, just tell him.
Guoshi only wants to tell your fortune for your own good. The moment he spoke, Hong Hong obediently told the time of his birth in a low voice. Guoshi knitted
his brows and started calculating with his fingers.
The people around watched him, talking in low voices,
and saw his expression grow dimmer and dimmer.
Si Lian watched, and became more and more solemn. 2. Guoshi looked to be no more than a tender 30-something young man, but Si Lian knew better than
most just how powerful his teacher was, to be able to rule over the Royal Holy Pavilion.
The number 1
Guoshi of Xianlei, Mei Nianqing, was famed throughout the land for his fortune-telling. Si Lian learned the
art of the sword and of spells from the deputy Guoshi, but never learned the art of fortune-telling from the
Guoshi himself, only because Guoshi told him it was an art of the streets, the golden stature of the crown.
Prince had no need for such tricks.
Plus, Si Lian himself wasn't interested, so he never tried.
However, whenever Guoshi worked his art, there were never mistakes. A while later, more and more cold sweat was rolling down the forehead of Guoshi, and he mumbled, no wonder, no wonder, no wonder he ruined the heavenly ceremonial procession, that the spirits of the Black Pagodas grew excited from sensing him, that the Xianlei pavilion was burned too. This is Truly.
Truly what?
Si Lian asked. Guoshi wiped his sweat and suddenly backed a meter away. Your Highness, you really brought something. You shouldn't have up the mountain. That small child is toxic.
His sign is born of the most ominous star.
The star of solitude. 8. Destined to bring misfortune and destruction, the kind that evil loves the most.
Whoever touches him will have misfortune befall him. Whoever gets close will lose their lives.
Before he even finished, there was a loud scream, and Hong Hong leapt to his feet, running towards Guoshi to headbutt him.
His voice was young and tender, but his screams were filled with rage, as if his heart was filled to the
brim with unspeakable pain and anguish, making many of those present shiver. That young child was covered in injuries, yet he tore and hit out at them like a red-eyed rabid dog, violent and aggressive.
The deputy Guoshi blocked Hong Hong and Guoshi backed away, yelling, "Make him leave the
mountain, hurry.
Don't touch him, I mean it. That fortune is too toxic, don't touch him."
The deputy Guoshi hurriedly moved aside, and New King and Feng Xin didn't know whether to act.
Seeing
that everyone was avoiding him like he was a poisonous snake, that child was shaken and started thrashing even harder, biting and screaming. I'm not. I'm not. Exclamation mark. I'm not. Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. Suddenly, a pair of arms wrapped him around the waist, encircling his small form.
A voice came from
above his head. You're not. I know you're not.
Don't cry, now.
I know you're not. That young child pressed his lips closed tightly, grabbing onto that pair of snow-white sleeves around his waist with a death grip. He forced himself to hold back for a long time, but in the end, he couldn't. A stream of tears suddenly rolled down from that round, black eye, and he burst out crying. Si Lian embraced him from behind and reiterated firmly, "It's not you. It's not your fault." 8 Tian Sha Guzing, the star of solitude, people with this sign in their fortunes are said to bring the greatest misfortune to those around them, while they themselves are fine, which is why it's called the star of solitude. This sign can be nullified with the meeting of a savior. On a separate note, Sha Po Lang is the other great sign of misfortune along with the star of solitude. These two signs are the most devastating in Chinese divination.